Paul Bearer once said there were wrestlers he just couldn't stand. Men who broke the code, bruised his pride, and disrespected everything he stood for. For years, fans have whispered about a secret list, a roster of names that made the ghostly manager's blood boil. But the truth is, Paul Bearer never sat down and counted out 10 wrestlers he hated. That list doesn't exist. Not in the way people think it does. What does exist is something far more interesting. A pattern of professional disgust carved into decades of shoot interviews, locker room politics, and the unforgiving code of the old school. William Moody didn't hate easily. He wasn't petty. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't the type to hold grudges over small mistakes or minor disagreements. But he was traditional, deeply, fundamentally traditional. And in a business that started abandoning tradition in the late 90s, that made him dangerous. Because when you stood for something in an industry that stood for nothing, everyone who didn't became your enemy. And Moody stood for a lot. He stood for respect. He stood for the craft. He stood for kayfabe, for hierarchy, for the invisible rules that kept the wrestling world spinning on its axis. When those rules got broken, Moody noticed, and he remembered, always. This isn't a list of petty grudges over missed spots or botched promos. This is a look inside the mind of one of wrestling's most respected yet unforgiving judges. A man who managed legends, trained future stars, and sat at the right hand of The Undertaker himself. A man who belonged to the Bone Street Crew, a backstage fraternity that enforced order when chaos threatened to consume the locker room. Paul Bearer wasn't just a character. He was an authority, a gatekeeper, a guardian of tradition in an era that wanted to tear tradition down. And authorities keep lists, not on paper, not in filing cabinets, in their heads, in their hearts. In the quiet moments when they watch someone disrespect the business and think, not you, never you. William Moody's journey began long before the urn and the ghostly voice, long before the pale makeup and the haunting presence that terrified children across America. As Percival Pringle III, he cut his teeth in the Texas territories. World-class championship wrestling became his university. The Sportatorium became his church. He worked alongside the Von Erich family for 6 years, learning the business from men who bled for it. Literally bled. He booked matches. He trained talent. He managed young wrestlers who would go on to change the industry forever. Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, back when he was just Texas Red, facing Bruiser Brody in his very first professional match. Moody didn't just watch history, he built it. He shaped it. He was there in the beginning, laying the foundation for careers that would define generations. When he arrived in the WWF as Paul Bearer, that history came with him. So did the expectations. So did the standards. He became the manager of The Undertaker, and together they created something untouchable. A character so complete, so immersive, that it transcended wrestling. But more than that, Moody became a member of the Bone Street Crew. The BSK wasn't just a friendship group. It wasn't a social club. It was a shadow government inside the WWF locker room. The Undertaker led it. Yokozuna, Mr. Fuji, The Godfather, Rikishi, and Paul Bearer filled its ranks. They were the enforcers, the protectors of the old code, the jury, the judge, and sometimes the executioner when someone stepped too far out of line. And when someone crossed that code, they answered to the BSK. They answered to men who had earned their power through decades of loyalty and sacrifice. So when we talk about who Paul Bearer hated, we're really talking about who violated his code, who disrespected the hierarchy, who put ego over the business, who forgot that wrestling was sacred, who treated the locker room like a democracy when it was really a monarchy. And once you understand who he really was behind that ghostly voice, once you peel back the character and see the man underneath, you'll see exactly why some people ended up on his bad side. You'll understand that every name on this list represents a violation, a sin against the church of professional wrestling, and Paul Bearer kept score. Let's count them down. Number 10, the Sandman. The Sandman probably never knew Paul Bearer had a problem with him. They barely crossed paths. They worked for different companies. They represented different philosophies. But Moody didn't need to work with someone to judge them. He just needed to watch. And what he saw in the Sandman was everything wrong with the new era of wrestling. Everything that threatened to destroy what he had spent his life building. Extreme Championship Wrestling brought a lot of things to the business. Energy, passion, a rawness that fans craved after years of cartoonish characters and safe programming. But it also brought garbage wrestling. And the Sandman was the poster child. He was the face of a movement that prioritized shock over substance, violence over storytelling, blood over technique. To Moody, wrestling was an art form. It required skill. It required psychology. It required athletes who could tell a story without relying on chairs, tables, and blood. You needed to make people believe with your body, your expression, your timing. The Sandman relied on all the wrong things. His matches were sloppy. His execution was reckless. His moveset was limited. He chugged beer, smashed cans on his head, and stumbled to the ring like a man who forgot he was supposed to be a professional. And worse, he was popular. spectacular. Fans ate it up. They chanted his name. They celebrated the chaos. They bought the merchandise. Moody hated that. He came from a world where men like Ric Flair could hold an audience for 60 minutes without a single weapon, where The Undertaker could terrify a crowd with nothing but presence and psychology, where technical excellence in character work mattered more than how many tables you could break. The Sandman represented laziness, a shortcut, a performer who drained company resources on medical bills and props instead of earning his paycheck through talent and dedication. In Moody's eyes, that wasn't wrestling. That was a circus act, a sideshow, and circuses belonged outside the business he loved. The broader issue was what the Sandman represented. He was proof that wrestling was changing, that the standards were dropping, that fans would accept anything as long as it was loud and violent and shocking. Moody understood that change was inevitable, but he also believed some changes were wrong, that some traditions existed for a reason, that the death of technical wrestling would lead to the death of wrestling itself. And every time he saw the Sandman bleed his way through another match, he saw the future, and it terrified him. Number 9, Vince Russo. Vince Russo wasn't a wrestler. He never took a bump, never cut a promo in front of a live crowd, never felt what it was like to stand in that ring with thousands of people hanging on your every move. But he made the list anyway, because if Paul Bearer hated anything more than a bad performer, it was the people who enabled them, the people who rewrote the rules, the people who killed kayfabe and called it progress. Russo was the architect of that murder. When Russo took control of WWE's creative direction in the late 90s, he brought a television writer's mindset to a wrestler's world. He prioritized shock over story. He exposed the business to make it feel real, not realizing that the business only worked when people believed the illusion. He broke the fourth wall. He referenced backstage politics and storylines. He treated wrestling like it was a reality show instead of a theatrical performance. Moody watched as storylines became convoluted, as traditions crumbled, as the mystique he spent decades building got torn apart for ratings. Moody was a booker himself back in WCW. He understood creative. He understood how to build a story over weeks and months, how to make fans care, how to protect kayfabe while giving them a reason to come back. That knowledge came from experience, from years of trial and error, from listening to veterans who taught him the craft. Russo had none of that. He came from television. He had ideas about what would work on TV, but he didn't understand wrestling. He didn't respect it. He treated it like any other show instead of recognizing it as something unique. Russo's era brought swerves, constant, exhausting swerves. Every week someone would turn heel or face for no reason. Championships changed hands on free TV. Storylines started and stopped without resolution. The focus shifted from long-term storytelling to short-term shock value, and ratings went up, at least for a while. But the cost was enormous. Wrestling lost its credibility. It lost its mystique. It lost the thing that made it special. Moody's shoot interviews made his feelings clear. He blamed the writers for the company's downturn. He blamed them for destroying the authenticity that made wrestling magical. And while he rarely named Russo directly, the implication was obvious. The subtext was clear. Russo's era represented everything Moody despised about modern wrestling. The death of tradition, the rise of cynicism, the corporate takeover of an art form that used to belong to the performers. The deeper wound was philosophical. Russo represented outsiders coming in and telling veterans they were wrong, that their way was outdated, that progress meant abandoning everything that worked before. Moody couldn't accept that. He believed the old way worked because it was based on decades of collective wisdom. The new way was based on one man's opinion, and that man had never wrestled a day in his life. Number 8, CM Punk. CM Punk was talented. Moody would have admitted that if pressed. The man could talk, he could work, he could connect with audiences in ways most performers couldn't, but talent wasn't enough. Not in the world Moody came from. In that world, you had to look the part. You had to carry yourself like a champion. You had to understand that the moment you walked into an arena, you were representing something bigger than yourself. CM Punk didn't get that. Or maybe he did and he just didn't care. The Undertaker had issues with Punk. And when The Undertaker had issues, Paul Bearer had issues. The problem was simple. Punk dressed like he didn't respect the business. He showed up looking casual, comfortable, like he forgot he was supposed to be the face of the company. He wore t-shirts and jeans when he should have worn suits. He looked like a fan who wandered into the locker room instead of a champion who earned his place there. To veterans like Moody, that was an insult. They came from an era where champions wore suits, where presentation mattered as much as performance, where image was everything because image was what sold tickets. Moody built his entire career on image. The mortician persona, the pale face, the urn that became more famous than most wrestlers, the voice that haunted children's nightmares and elevated every promo he touched. He committed to that character completely. He understood that the illusion only worked if everyone protected it, if everyone maintained their character even when cameras weren't rolling. Punk's casual attitude threatened that illusion. It sent a message message that wrestling wasn't serious, that the championship wasn't sacred, that you could half commit and still succeed. And that message enraged the old guard, Moody included. The issue went deeper than clothing. It was about respect, about understanding that you stood on the shoulders of giants, that men like Bruno Sammartino and Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan built the industry you were profiting from. And the least you could do was dress like you appreciated that. Punk acted like he was above tradition, like the rules didn't apply to him because he was different. He was a rebel, an outsider. But the locker room had seen rebels before. They'd seen outsiders. And the ones who succeeded were the ones who respected the veterans even while pushing boundaries. Punk didn't respect anyone, and that made him dangerous. Moody saw Punk as symptomatic of a larger problem, a generation of wrestlers who thought they knew better, who thought the old ways were stupid and outdated, who didn't realize those old ways existed for a reason. Punk was talented enough to get away with it, but that didn't make it right, and Moody never forgot. Number 7, Diamond Dallas Page. Diamond Dallas Page made a fatal mistake. He tried to teach The Undertaker how to wrestle. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. DDP was successful in WCW. He was a main eventer, a former world champion. He had every right to be confident in his abilities. But confidence becomes arrogance when you forget where you are. And when DDP arrived in WWE, he forgot. Or maybe he never understood in the first place. The story became legendary in locker room lore. During preparations for a match, DDP attempted to instruct The Undertaker on how their bout should be structured. To anyone outside wrestling, that might seem reasonable. Two professionals collaborating, working together to create the best possible match. But inside wrestling, it was heresy. The Undertaker was a 20-year veteran, a locker room leader, a man who had main evented WrestleMania multiple times, a performer who had carried the company through its darkest periods. You didn't teach him. You listened to him. You deferred to him. You showed respect. DDP's mistake wasn't just professional, it was personal, because The Undertaker led the Bone Street crew, and Paul Bearer was BSK. That meant DDP's disrespect toward Taker was disrespect toward Moody. It was a violation of the hierarchy that kept the locker room functioning. In Moody's world, veterans had earned their authority through decades of sacrifice. You didn't arrive from a rival company and start giving orders. You paid your dues. You proved yourself. You waited your turn. You showed deference to the established order. The hierarchy existed for a reason. Without it, the locker room became chaos. Everyone thought they knew best. Everyone wanted to be the star. Everyone wanted their ideas implemented. But wrestling only worked when there was structure, when younger talent deferred to veterans who had proven themselves over time. DDP violated that structure. He walked into WWE thinking his WCW success meant something. And in a sense, it did. But it didn't mean he could disrespect The Undertaker. Moody took it personally because he had history with both men involved. He managed The Undertaker from the beginning. He was there for Taker's debut. He helped build the character into what it became. And then DDP showed up and acted like none of that mattered. Like Taker was just another opponent. Like 20 years of experience could be ignored because DDP had ideas. That kind of arrogance couldn't be tolerated. Not by Taker, and certainly not by Paul Bearer. The incident became a teaching moment, a reminder that in wrestling, hierarchy matters, that respect isn't optional, that you earn your place through years of consistency and dedication. DDP never fully recovered his standing in WWE, and Moody never forgave him, because the disrespect wasn't just about one match or one conversation, it was about understanding your place in the industry, and DDP never did. Number 6, the Clique as a unit. The Clique wasn't one person, it was 5. Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Triple H, Sean Waltman. Together, they represented everything Paul Bearer despised about backstage politics. They were talented, absolutely. Some of the most talented performers of their generation, but they used that talent as a weapon. They manipulated booking. They protected each other at the expense of everyone else. They turned the locker room into a game where friendship mattered more than merit, where loyalty to the group mattered more than loyalty to the business. Moody's shoot interviews dedicated significant time to the Clique. He didn't hide his feelings. He didn't dance around the subject. He saw them as a disruptive force, a political machine that challenged the traditional chain of command. In the territory days, veterans controlled the locker room through respect and seniority. The Clique controlled it through leverage. They threatened to leave. They politicked with management. They made sure their friends got pushed while everyone else got buried. They operated as a unit, using their combined influence to dictate booking decisions. The Bone Street crew existed partially as a response to the Clique. While the Clique played politics, the BSK enforced order. They were the old guard pushing back against the new regime. They represented tradition and professionalism against manipulation and self-interest. And Moody was at the center of that war. To him, the Clique represented the death of professionalism, the rise of ego, the moment wrestling stopped being about the business and started being about individuals protecting their spots. The most infamous example was the curtain call, Madison Square Garden, 1996. Shawn Michaels and Diesel were leaving for WCW. They broke character to hug Scott Hall and Triple H in the ring after a match. They exposed the business in front of a live crowd. They showed fans that heels and faces were friends behind the scenes. They destroyed kayfabe for a moment of sentimentality, and they did it because they thought they were above the rules, because they thought their friendship mattered more than the illusion that kept the business alive. Moody hated that moment. It symbolized everything wrong with the clique. They put themselves first. They exposed the business because they wanted a moment. They didn't care about the damage. They didn't care about the younger wrestlers who had to rebuild credibility after fans saw through the curtain. They cared about their bond, their brotherhood, and they expected everyone else to accept it. He didn't hate each member equally. Some were worse than others. Some were more manipulative. Some were more arrogant. But he hated what they represented: the erosion of tradition, the prioritization of personal gain over collective success, the idea that you could disrespect the veterans who built the industry and still get rewarded for it. In Moody's world, that was unforgivable, and the clique did it every single day. Number 5, Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels deserves his own entry because he was the face of the clique, the leader, the most talented and the most dangerous. Moody's relationship with Michaels was complicated. Professionally, he recognized Michaels as one of the greatest performers in history, perhaps the greatest in-ring worker of his generation, a man who could have a 5-star match with a broomstick. But personally, he couldn't stand him because Michaels embodied every bad habit that made the 90s locker room toxic. Michaels was a political mastermind. He understood power. He understood leverage. He manipulated booking decisions through his relationship with Vince McMahon. He refused to put over talent he didn't like. He used his relationship with management to protect his position at the top of the card. And he did it all with a smile, with charm, with the confidence of someone who knew he was untouchable. The most famous example was WrestleMania 14. Michaels was supposed to lose to Stone Cold Steve Austin, passing the torch to the next generation, but he dragged his feet. He resisted. He made the process miserable for everyone involved. It took The Undertaker himself to force Michaels into compliance, to tell him that he was losing whether he liked it or not. That story mattered to Moody because Stone Cold Steve Austin was his boy. Moody trained him in WCCW. He managed him in Dallas. He watched Austin grow from a rookie who could barely cut a promo into a superstar who would define an era. And when Michaels tried to sabotage Austin's moment, Moody took it personally. It wasn't just about one match. It was about respect, about understanding that your job as a veteran is to elevate the next generation, not hold them down, about recognizing when your time is ending and someone else's time is beginning. Michaels was also a member of the clique, which automatically put him in Moody's crosshairs. But more than that, Michaels represented chronic disrespect toward the hierarchy. He treated the locker room like his personal kingdom. He bullied people. He threw tantrums. He made life miserable for anyone who didn't fall in line. There are stories of Michaels destroying careers through backstage politics, of talented wrestlers who never got their chance because Michaels didn't like them, of matches that never happened because Michaels refused to work with certain people. The BSK noticed. They didn't forget, and neither did Paul Bearer. Michaels represented everything wrong with giving too much power to one person, with allowing talent to dictate business decisions, with prioritizing star power over fairness. Moody believed in meritocracy, in earning your position through hard work and respect. Michaels earned his position through politics and manipulation, and that difference mattered. It mattered to Moody. It mattered to The Undertaker. It mattered to everyone who believed wrestling should be about more than who had the most leverage. Years later, Michaels found religion. He cleaned up his act. He became a model professional. He put people over without complaint. He became everything he should have been from the beginning. But Moody never saw that transformation. He retired before Michaels completed his redemption arc. So in Moody's memory, Michaels would always be the political manipulator, the egomaniac, the man who almost derailed Austin's career for personal reasons. And that's a legacy that's hard to escape. Number 4, WWE creative and the corporate writers. If you want to understand Paul Bearer's rage, you have to understand what the corporate writers stole from him. They stole the soul of wrestling, the storytelling, the mystique, the magic. They replaced it with scripts, focus groups, demographic targeting, market research. They turned an art form into a product, and Moody watched it happen in real time. Watched the business he loved become something he barely recognized. Moody was a booker in WCCW. He understood how to build a story over weeks and months. The new writers had none of that. They came from television, from Hollywood. They had degrees and resumes, but no respect for tradition. They had theories, but no practical experience. They understood story structure, but not wrestling psychology. Moody's shoot interview interviews dedicated extensive time to this topic. He blamed the writers for the company's downturn. He blamed them for the death of kayfabe. He blamed them for creating a system where performers became puppets instead of storytellers. And he was right. The shift from wrestler-driven booking to corporate creative control changed everything. Storylines became convoluted, characters lost depth, promos became scripted word for word instead of bullet points performers could interpret. The business stopped feeling real because the people writing it didn't understand what made it real in the first place. For Moody, this was personal. His entire career was built on character immersion. The Paul Bearer persona worked because he committed to it completely. He was a mortician. He carried an urn. He spoke in that haunting voice even when cameras weren't rolling. That level of commitment required freedom, trust, the ability to adapt and improvise based on crowd reactions. The writers took that freedom away. They handed performers scripts and told them to memorize lines. They killed spontaneity. They killed authenticity. And in doing so, they killed the thing that made wrestling special. The writers also didn't understand psychology. They didn't understand why certain things worked and others didn't. They created angles based on what sounded good in a writer's room instead of what would actually draw money. They prioritized moments over stories. They wanted viral clips instead of long-term investment. They measured success in social media engagement instead of ticket sales and pay-per-view buys. Moody hated the writers more than he hated any individual wrestler because the writers represented systemic failure. They were the reason young talent couldn't develop naturally, the reason veterans got sidelined, the reason characters became generic and interchangeable, the reason promos all sounded the same. They were the reason the business he loved became something he barely recognized. And unlike a wrestler you could confront in the locker room, you couldn't fight the corporate structure. You could only watch it destroy everything you built. You could only voice your objections and shoot interviews that most fans would never see. You could only refuse to participate and hope someone noticed. His decision to prefer babysitting The Undertaker over accepting a front office position tells you everything you need to know. He would rather deal with the daily chaos of managing wrestling's most intense character than participate in the corporate bureaucracy, because the front office represented surrender. It represented accepting the new system, and Moody never surrendered. Not to anyone, not to anything. Number 3, Vader was the only main event star Paul Bearer called out by name in his shoot interviews, and the reason he called him out was almost insulting in its pettiness. Vader complained that Paul Bearer was stealing his spotlight, that the crowd was watching the manager instead of the wrestler, that the ghostly mortician with the urn was more interesting than the 500-pound monster in the ring. Let that sink in for a moment. Vader, a man booked as an unstoppable force, admitted he couldn't compete with a manager holding a prop. And instead of recognizing that as his own failure, he blamed Moody. He got vocal backstage. He made his frustration known, and Moody never forgot. From Moody's perspective, this was inexcusable, unforgivable. A manager's job is to enhance the wrestler, to draw heat, to give the performer an advantage in storytelling, to create moments and build intrigue. If the crowd is watching the manager, that's because the manager is doing their job. But the wrestler still has to close the deal. They still have to be compelling enough to hold attention once the bell rings. Vader wasn't, or at least he wasn't confident he was. And that insecurity exposed a fundamental weakness, a crack in the foundation that should never exist in a main event performer. Moody had managed The Undertaker for years. Taker never complained about being overshadowed. He understood that Paul Bearer's presence elevated the character, that the urn added mystique, that the promos gave The Undertaker an emotional depth he couldn't convey alone. Neither did Kane, neither did Mankind, because great performers understand that everyone on screen contributes to the story, that wrestling is collaborative, that you don't succeed by diminishing others. You succeed by elevating everyone around you. Vader didn't understand that, or he understood it and his ego couldn't accept it. Either way, it proved he wasn't ready for the top spot. Not mentally, not professionally. The feud wasn't just about ego. It was about work ethic, about professionalism. Moody came from an era where you protected the business, where you made your opponent look good because that's what drew money, where you understood that wrestling only worked when everyone cooperated. Vader wanted to protect himself. He wanted to be the center of attention at all times. He wanted the crowd focused only on him. That selfishness went against everything Moody believed, and it confirmed what Moody already suspected, that some people didn't belong at the top of the card, no matter how much they were pushed, no matter how impressive they looked, no matter how hard they hit. The criticism also revealed something about Moody's standards. He expected main eventers to have complete confidence in their ability to hold an audience, to trust that their presence alone was enough. Vader's complaints suggested he didn't have that confidence, that he needed every advantage, that he couldn't afford to share the spotlight because he wasn't sure he could command it alone. And in Moody's world, that was disqualifying. Main eventers were supposed to be leaders. They were supposed to elevate everyone around them. They were supposed to make the show better by being on it. Vader made the show worse by complaining about his manager. Number 2, the enemies of The Undertaker. Paul Bearer's loyalty to The Undertaker defined his career. For 2 decades, he stood beside the dead man. He carried the urn. He cut the promos. He took the bumps. He protected the character with everything he had. And in return, The Undertaker protected him. That bond was unbreakable, unconditional. It transcended wrestling and became something deeper. Friendship, brotherhood, loyalty that couldn't be bought or broken, which meant anyone who crossed The Undertaker automatically crossed Paul Bearer. There was no separation, no neutrality. If you had heat with Taker, you had heat with Moody. The list of Undertaker's enemies became Moody's list. It had to, because in the world of the Bone Street Crew, loyalty wasn't negotiable. If you disrespected the leader, you disrespected the crew. And the crew remembered. They kept score. They enforced consequences. Shawn Michaels, already mentioned, topped that list. His refusal to put over Austin at WrestleMania 14 required Taker's intervention. DDP, also mentioned, tried to teach Taker how to work. CM Punk dressed like he didn't care about the business. Each of these men earned Undertaker's heat, and each of them earned Moody's by extension. But there were others. Wrestlers who never made headlines but still violated the code. Performers who showed up late to events, who sandbagged their opponents in the ring, who talked trash about Taker behind his back, who questioned his position, who thought they knew better. Moody heard it all. He was Taker's right hand, his confidant, his protector, his eyes and ears in the locker room. And he kept a mental ledger of every slight, every insult, every moment of disrespect. Nothing was forgotten. Nothing was forgiven. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't pettiness. It was survival. The locker room was a hierarchy. The Undertaker sat at the top, and everyone below had to acknowledge that. Not because Taker demanded it through intimidation, but because he earned it through decades of consistency. He showed up. He performed. He carried the company through its darkest periods. He main evented WrestleManias. He created moments that defined the industry. He was the locker room leader, not through politics, but through respect. Anyone who didn't respect that was a threat, not just to Taker, but to the entire system that kept the locker room functioning. Moody understood this better than anyone. He was part of that system. He enforced it. He was the BSK's voice in many ways. And when someone stepped out of line, he didn't just notice. He cataloged it. He remembered. He made sure others remembered too. Because in wrestling, reputation is everything. Your reputation determines your position, your opportunities, your future. And Moody's reputation as a loyalist was absolute, unquestionable. Everyone knew that crossing The Undertaker meant crossing Paul Bearer, and that meant answering to the BSK. The proxy nature of this heat reveals something important about locker room politics. You didn't just have relationships with individuals. You had relationships with their entire circle. The Undertaker's enemies became the BSK's enemies. The wrestling operated on a system of alliances and feuds that extended far beyond individual interactions. Moody's position within the BSK meant he inherited all of Taker's conflicts, and he accepted that gladly, because loyalty meant everything, because protecting your people was the most important duty anyone could have, because in a business full of politicians and opportunists, standing by your friends was the only thing that mattered. Number 1, the system that betrayed him. The person Paul Bearer hated most wasn't a person at all. It was the system, the corporate machine that transformed wrestling from a territorial tradition into a global entertainment conglomerate. The system that replaced veteran wisdom with executive decisions. The system that prioritized profits over storytelling. The system that killed kayfabe and called it evolution. The system that took everything beautiful about wrestling and turned it into content, product, merchandise, intellectual property. Moody's entire career was built on the old way. You paid your dues in the territories. You learned from veterans who had been doing this for decades. You respected the hierarchy. You protected the business at all costs. You understood that wrestling was a sacred trust between performer and audience. That trust required commitment. It required sacrifice. It required everyone involved to maintain the illusion, even when cameras stopped rolling, even when it hurt, even when it cost you opportunities. The system destroyed that trust. It exposed the inner workings. It hired writers who didn't understand wrestling. It pushed performers who looked good on paper but couldn't connect with crowds. It measured success in metrics instead of passion, quarterly earnings instead of crowd reactions, social media engagement instead of ticket sales. It turned something magical into something corporate, something soulless, something that resembled wrestling but wasn't really wrestling at all. Moody saw it happening and couldn't stop it. He voiced his concerns in shoot interviews. He criticized the creative direction. He mourned the death of kayfabe, but none of it mattered. The machine kept rolling. It rolled over veterans who objected. It rolled over traditions that had sustained the business for decades. It rolled over anyone who suggested maybe the old way had value worth preserving. And eventually, it rolled right over him. His later years in WWE were defined by frustration. He took on roles as a road agent and talent scout, trying to maintain standards from behind the scenes. But the standards standards kept slipping, the business kept changing, and Moody kept losing battles he couldn't win. The most telling detail came from one of his interviews. He said he preferred babysitting The Undertaker over taking a corporate office position. Think about that. Really think about what that means. He would rather deal with the daily chaos of managing wrestling's most intense character than participate in the front office, then sit in meetings, then contribute to the system, because the front office represented everything wrong with modern wrestling. The bureaucracy, the politics, the disconnect from what made the business work, the distance between decision makers and performers, the idea that people who had never taken a bump could dictate how wrestling should be presented. Moody's hatred of the system wasn't personal, it was philosophical. He believed wrestling was dying, that the traditions he cherished were being abandoned, that the next generation would inherit a hollow imitation of what he helped build, that kayfabe was dead and nothing could replace it, that corporate ownership would destroy the last remnants of territorial independence, that wrestling would become just another entertainment product instead of something unique and special, and he was powerless to prevent it. All he could do was voice his disapproval, refuse to compromise, hold on to the old code even as everyone around him moved on, even as younger wrestlers rolled their eyes at his stories about the territories, even as executives dismissed his concerns as outdated thinking. That refusal made him a relic, an old man yelling at changes he couldn't control, a dinosaur refusing to evolve. But it also made him honest, because someone had to say it. Someone had to stand up and declare that progress wasn't always progress,